Section 10 of the American Egypt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American Egypt by Channing Arnold and Frederick J. Tabor Frost. Section 10. Valladolid and After, Part 1. There are two kinds of brigands in Yucatan. There is the honest fellow who cuts your throat without apology, or waits behind a tree and puts a bullet into your back at a 10-yard range, and there is the oily-tongued "con permiso," detestable phrase ever on Yucatecan lips. Rascal who, permission or not, will see to it that your last centavo is his, if he can manage it. At Valladolid, whither we went from Chichen, we made our first serious acquaintance with the latter. One or two pleasant little episodes had occurred at Merida, but they were only in the nature of dress rehearsals. Valladolid, railhead, frontier town, is the back of beyond in Yucatan. Today it is the most important township on the border line dividing the enslaved Indians from those few thousands who are still maintaining their independence against the criminal recruited forces of Diaz. In the revolt of 1847 and in all the lesser Indian risings, it has been the jumping off ground for the rebels. It is a long dirty street of shabby houses, ending in a weed-choked, down-on-its-luck sort of plaza, at one side of which is a huge gaunt stuccoed church surrounded by tumbling 3-foot walls. The whole place has a shamefaced, seen better days kind of air, and if it is indeed true that it has claims to be reckoned a health resort, one feels, as did the martyr to gout, when recommended to a very dull town for its baths, that one prefers the gout. It was on the 28th of May, 1543, that Montejo founded the town on the site of the Indian settlement of Chanakha. This native name means large water, in reference to a great lagoon of sweet water on the northward. It was the fertility of the country around, due to this swamp, for it was nothing else, which had attracted the Spaniards. But this in turn betrayed them, for, ere a year had elapsed, the place had proved so malarious that it was determined to move the town to the neighbouring Indian pueblo of Saki. There, on the 24th of March, 1544, the Valladolid of today was founded, its plaza being on the site of a huge Mayan temple built on a lofty pyramid. Not a stone or trace of the Indian work now remains, but tradition relates that in the temple was an idol of pottery, regarded as of great sanctity, and to which the Indians for miles round made pilgrimages for adoration. There is some reason to believe that this idol was in the form of the tapir, in Maya called zimin. There is no doubt that the queer pig deer which is still found in the southern forests of Yucatan and in Chiapas held an important place in Mayan mythology, and the account of this idol of pottery at Saki, worshipped as a Zakik Ual, Lord of the East Wind, which is described as being shaped like a huge vase moulded in front into an ugly face, suggests that there was here a temple dedicated to that tapir god, replicas of whose image have been found moulded in vase form in many parts of southern Yucatan and especially in Guatemala. The interior of the huge vase was not probably used for the burning of copal, the figure thus being, as appears to have been so often the case, idol and altar in one. We had left Chichen as we had reached it in the dark, but this time it was the darkness before dawn, and with no moon, the castillo looked gloomy and awesome in its setting of black woods. With our pockets full of oranges from the hospitable trees of the hacienda, and our hearts full of wonder at the ruins amid which we had spent so many interesting days, we turned our horses' heads once more towards Citas, where we were due to catch another early train. It was perilous work, picking your way in the gloom amid the boulders of the Camino Real, as the Spaniards euphemistically call these execrable high roads. One wonders what a sham camino would be like if this is a real one. But the dawn was worth seeing in those dark woods, dripping with a heavy tropical dew. The glorious sun came, and the slate greys and blacks turned to silvers and lustrous greens, and the dank, sodden boughs changed to fairy wands, trimmed with diamonds as the sun touched them, and the sombre sky turned into such a blue, and the reds and ambers, the azures and the greens, of birds and butterflies as they woke for another day were so wonderful that one caught the infection of it, the magic of God's tropic woodland, and we forgot the troubles of boulder-strewn roads and horn-pommelled Mexican saddles. We found Citas, the same dirty little place we had left it a week past, and the people as stupid as ever. But after some difficulties with our baggage, we did eventually reach Valladolid towards midday. To the Jefe Politico there, we had a letter from the Governor of Yucatan bidding him treat us in a very special manner. The Jefe was a feeble, melancholy, epicene little man, who wore spring-side boots, carried a lady's silver-topped umbrella and a fan, and perpetually smoked straw cigarettes. His hair was dyed and his manner was wistfully bored. He was fetched from his hammock to receive us, and extended a damp bird-like claw of a hand. He offered us no hospitality, but led the way down the street to a filthy shop, in the rear of which was a barn, furnished with two hammocks and an enamelled bowl perched on an empty soap box, serving as dressing table and wash-stand. For food he directed us to a reeking little drinking den. Having thus exhausted his energies in this very special manner, he retired, promising to return in the evening to assist us in the purchase of stores for our journey through the forest. There was very little to see in Valladolid. The Spanish Vandals had taken care of that. All traces of the old Indian domination had been effectually wiped out. At the Jefetura, the courthouse or town hall in the plaza, signs were not lacking of the troubled state of the country. Bands of soldiers were loitering under the verandas, cleaning rifles and smoking cigarettes. We call them soldiers because that is what they call themselves, but they were certainly the sloppiest, most ill-disciplined body of men who ever disgraced that name. They were dressed in loose flying cotton shifts and cotton trousers rolled up to the knee. Their feet were sandaled, and on their heads were queer pudding basin-shaped straw hats with red ribbon lettered in black 5 Bat GN, which means 5th Battalion National Guard. Ever since the War of Extermination, some of the iniquities of which we shall presently relate, was started, Valladolid never knows quite where she is. Raiding parties of Indians loiter in the woods to the eastward, and make periodic descents upon outlying houses and government convoys. We attached to us a Yucatecan lad, sadly enough far advanced in consumption, who, unlike his fellow citizens, was frank and pleasant-mannered and anxious to please. With him as our guide we visited a neighbouring cenote, the water supply of the ancient Indian city. This was very unlike those at Chichen, for it was not very deep down and was of open approach. In a basin some 100 feet wide lay the water, grass green with water weed, and far over it jutted a natural roof of rock, from which hang stalactites, a row of grey stone icicles some 30 feet long, like a fairy fringe over the pool. We made our way down the steep rocky side to a narrow ledge of rock which ran halfway round the cenote, some 20 feet above water level. Here there were caves where we were told jaguars sometimes sheltered. The Jefe Politico was due to join us at 8 o'clock, and on our return to the town we waited with what patience we could for him. But he never appeared. So we made the best of a bad bargain and a tour of the shops, succeeding in being swindled over each item of our commissariat. On the morrow, anxious to be starting, we walked over to the Jefetura to wake the mayor up. There, under the veranda, in a ring, sat the rude forefathers of this Yucatecan hamlet, the ancient Jefe in the middle. There is a local proverb, "Hay mucho vago en Valladolid." There are many loiterers in Valladolid, and no better realization of its truth could there have been than this band of venerable officials drowsing their morning away. We were invited within the magic circle, but even our execrable Spanish failed to rouse them. They had nothing to do, so they sat in the shade and did it, and the street crowd had nothing to do, so they hung on the veranda railings and stared at the first Englishmen reckless enough to visit the city of Doolittles. But smoking cigarettes and endeavouring to remember the past and future tenses of irregular Spanish verbs pall as occupations, and losing all patience, we informed the somnolent mayor that unless our wants in the matter of horses and a servant were promptly satisfied, we would make a complaint to the governor of the state. This threat galvanized the band of Valladolitels into a frenzy of energy. Soldiers were summoned and came forward at the salute with fixed bayonets. 2 were dispatched to get us hammocks. A third went off to seek a horse dealer, while a fourth, actually the sentry on duty, under the directions of the Jefe, solemnly laid aside his rifle and set to work to peel a plate of oranges which had been produced to assist in our pacification. The hammock-seeking warriors returned with a string of Indian women, each nursing a special line of hammocks. Of course prices had rushed up at the mere rumour of us, and having been assured in Merida that hammocks, a staple product of the town, were cheap in Valladolid, we were naturally disappointed to find that the commonest of those brought to be shown us were about 3 times their normal value. But hammocks we had to have, so we bought a couple of strong cloth ones at an exorbitant price, and a portion of the National Guard were told off to string them. Then came the horse dealers with all the maimed, the halt, and the blind of equine Valladolid. The prices asked for these chargers were truly tropical, and had grown to a great height. But no Englishman had ever visited the town before, and it was far too good a chance to be lost. We do not want to libel the somnolescent Jefe, but it was probably as much as his place was worth to refuse to cock the blind one on the frauds which his fellow citizens were attempting to play on us. He was no man for half measures in such a delicate matter, so he retired into the mayor's parlour to take a nap while we argued. None of the mounts were in the first flush of their giddy youth, and some looked Methuselahs. There was a horse with a sore on its back as big as a cheese plate, which the owner resolutely declined to part with for less than $100, while another steed, badly spavined, was so precious to its lucky proprietor that with tears in his avaricious eyes he assured us it would break his heart to accept for this peerless mount less than double that sum. Fortunately we knew something about horses, and were able to slowly but surely to weed out the crooks, though the rapacious crowd did all in their power to fool us. It ended in our giving $100 too much for the 3 horses we selected, but they were at least sound in wind and limb. though the strongest, a stallion, was blind in the right eye. The mayor, having been waked up by a soldier, then regretfully took an active part in the proceedings. To prevent horse stealing, the purchase of a horse in Yucatan is attended by the utmost official ceremony. If the occasion had been an auction of blood stock at Tattersall's, these fatuous Yucatecan officials could not have made more fuss. Armed with notebooks, they waltzed round our sorry purchases, marking down their peculiarities. We did not see the books, but it is quite likely that they were entered as having 4 legs and a tail. At any rate, it took the united efforts of the town council to make out the official receipts, which bore so many stamps as must have crippled the resources of the local GPO for some weeks. But it is one thing to buy a Yucatecan horse, and it is quite another to load him with portmanteaus sewn into sacks. The stallion, which, as the strongest of the trio, we had selected to carry the heaviest of the baggage, had not signed on for any such nonsense, and fixing us with his one eye, which rolled as viciously as it could in its deserted state, he signified intense dissatisfaction with all loads and portmanteaus in particular by letting out his heels at the mayor, and then rearing up and pawing the air, Pegasus fashion, over a knot of sloppy, becottoned troops who broke and ran in all directions. He was really quite a nice horse. We afterwards nicknamed him Cyclops, in affectionate allusion to his ocular defects, and grew to be quite fond of him. But he was not at all nice on first acquaintance, and a crowd of jeering Valladolitas, far too scared to come within the lash of his hoofs, collected at a respectful distance to watch the fun. The mayor had half an hour before presented us with a soldier servant who owned the name Contrario, and rejoiced on all occasions in deserving it by his obstinacy. We had come into the country expecting to find every man a Buffalo Bill. But these troops were very disappointing. They were so obtrusively foot soldiers. They evidently agreed with the psalmist that a horse is a vain thing for safety, and Contrario, told to hold Cyclops, absolutely refused. But the crowd was growing with our anger, and it was no time for mutiny. So by sheer physical force we made the poor shivering wretch carry out our orders. Again and again we tried to get the baggage on. No sooner did Cyclops feel the first pressure of the load, which we adroitly brought up on his blind side, than he plunged and bucked like the veriest bronco, throwing the baggage into the dust. Disappointed in their malicious hope that we should have to give it up, one or two of the crowd began to take a friendly interest in our efforts, and one man, a big fellow for a Yucatecan, but obviously as timid of horses as our soldier servant, volunteered to help. This time we got the twin sacks well over the stallion's back before he plunged, and the rope, adroitly thrown round, kept them in position till he quieted down, and made up his mind to the inevitable. It was all over except the jeering, and fearful as we were of mounting our saddle horses and leaving the recalcitrant Cyclops with his hated load to the feeble management of Contrario, we ignominiously led the horses out of the horrid little town amid an accompaniment of this from the citizens. But it was such an infinite relief to turn our backs upon the city of Doolittles and brigands that we could have calmly borne twice the mockery hurled at us by that yellow-faced shambling crowd. Our way lay for the next few days through 40-odd miles of a country densely wooded but traversed by a fair road. This latter had earned a bad reputation of late as being infested by bandits, Mexican criminals shipped from Vera Cruz to serve against the Indians, who had deserted and betaken themselves to the woods with their rifles. Only a few days before our arrival a gang of them had murdered 3 Indians who were in charge of a drove of pigs. It had been such color work, inducing the Dulitalians to do even the little they did, that it was wearing well on to 4 o'clock before we found ourselves out into the open. Once past the outlying huts of Valladolid, the dust of the rock-strewn road changed into a brick red loam. In many parts of Yucatan, for scores of miles at a time, the tracks through the forest are red like this, suggestive of nothing so much as a rough cart road to an English brick field. Once you have seen one such road, you have seen them all, for they are as like as two pins. The dense woods hemmed us in on each side, and the monotony was only broken now and again by meeting straggling parties of Indians, naked but for breech cloth, with rough plaited straw hats, their long guns slung on their brown backs, a linen hunting bag at their waist, on their way to shoot in the woods. Throughout eastern Yucatan every Indian is out at dawn and sundown to pick up something for the pot. Their guns are for the most part antiquated muzzle loaders, single barrelled, sometimes of obviously home manufacture. They are poor sportsmen from the English point of view, for they are out to kill, and they think nothing of following a bird up for a mile or two till they can shoot it sitting. They were a very different breed of men from those Indians we had seen nearer Merida, and some of them even looked truculent. But they gave us a very civil "Buenas tardes" (good afternoon) as they stopped to rest on their guns and gaze with wonder at such an unusual spectacle as two khaki-clad Englishmen and the three laden horses. We were not able to make much progress before the sun was near setting, and we kept our eyes open for a likely spot to make our camp. Shortly before 6 we halted on the Tizimin side of the small Indian village of Kursuk. We cut our way some 50 yards into the wood, and with axes made a clearing of some 20 feet square, slinging our hammocks between the trees. Tethering the horses to stout saplings, we sent Contrario to the village for water, but before we had got our saucepans boiling, darkness was on us, and we had to make the best of a meal eaten in a gloom which made it impossible to tell a spoonful of black beans from a spoonful of egg till you tasted them. In this Cimmerian darkness we managed to make the deplorable discovery that we had forgotten to provide cups, and we found ourselves in the ludicrously Tantalus-like position of having a saucepan too hot to drink from, of boiling Cadbury's cocoa, and nothing to put the precious liquid in. Then one of us had the happy inspiration of utilising the saucepan lid. A great deal of real fun can be got out of drinking boiling hot cocoa from a saucepan lid. It is so aggravatingly shallow, so infernally hot to hold, and so top heavy. But we were far too tired with the dusty tramp, after our long day's battle with the detestable inhabitants of Valladolid, to make mountains out of molehills. If we had had cups, we should have got through the precious draught far too quickly, we reminded ourselves. Pleasure is anticipation, and waiting in the dark, seated on a boulder by the fire we had built in the red road, for your turn at the shallow draught, was a real joy. We got outside our precious Cadbury, the black beans, and the eggs, and then we rolled ourselves into our hammocks, making cocoons of ourselves in our Mexican blankets, and, with our soldier servant stretched on a blanket on the ground between the two of us, we were soon fast asleep. Each day of our march through this forest country was much the same as the last. We waked in the bitter cold of the early dawn, huge drops of dew falling from the trees overhead upon the rubber sheeting which we had had the foresight to take with us to act as counterpane. Each night we camped afresh in the forests, making a clearing some little way from the road, and despite the alarmist rumours which had reached us in Merida and elsewhere of the dangers attending such forest campings, we had but one serious alarm. We had been asleep some hours, dead tired with our day's march, when we waked to find the fire, which we had left on the roadside mere embers, flaming 3 feet high. We did not know why we waked, and we do not know now, for there was no noise to disturb us, and it was quite an unusual thing. As a rule we slept like logs. All we know is that we did wake, and to our astonishment saw the fire, which we had carefully stamped out on turning in, blazing high. We were wondering what this could mean, when in the rear of us we heard stealthy footsteps, the brushwood crackling as if some 2 or 3 people were creeping in upon us. It was a very dark moonless night, and altogether the position was decidedly uncanny. We reached for our revolvers, which always hung by their belts at the hammock head, and sat up waiting. Whoever it was had seen us move, for all was still at first, and then, after a few minutes of dead silence, we distinctly heard the footsteps retreating. Possibly, as our horses were tethered on the side nearest the road, the robbers did not care to venture in that way, but made up our fire that the glare might guide them in a wide detour through the wood in rear of us. They had no doubt hoped to find us asleep, to have dashed in upon us and given us a slash over the head with their long knives, and then ransacked our baggage at their leisure. Finding that we were awake, however, and that they would have to fight for this privilege, they decamped. But brigand alarms, though the most dignified, were not our only troubles in the forests. All Yucatan, wherever there are cattle, is cursed with an insect pest, a cattle louse known as the garrapatas. In these first days we suffered much from them. To look at, they are like a cross between the ordinary bed bug and a sheep tick, but they often have markings on their backs like those on a garden spider. They get onto coat sleeve or riding breeches, often tiny as money spiders, in scores at a time. They hang in brown patches upon the leaves and branches of shrubs and bushes, and if you just brush against these, before you have time to notice almost, the insects have climbed all over you, in a few minutes, fixing themselves in the flesh and digging their way in till nothing but the rounded tops of their backs are visible. Their bites are not at first painful, but become intensely irritable after a day or two, and cause troublesome swellings, if in any great numbers. It is nothing uncommon to find 50 or 100 of these tiny plagues on one after a day's riding through the bush. Cleanliness is no prophylactic against them. The only thing we found any good was to make a strong solution of tobacco and smear this well over legs, thighs, and arms when dressing. This keeps some of the less hardier ones at bay, but the really big ones, we found one as big as 3 penny piece fastened on to the hinge of the lid of a box tortoise in the woods at Chichen, stop at nothing, and no pulling will get them out. The only thing to do is to let them work their wicked will off you, when, after a day or two, they fill up with blood and turn a deep purple colour like a black Hamburg grape. In this aldermanic condition of repletion they are very easily detached, and alas, squashed. The Yucatecans are a cleanly people and bathe a great deal, the poor as well as rich, but nothing astonished Contrario more than a rubber bath. This, which we had bought in London, folded into so small a space that it was a treat to watch his face when we first unfolded it and he saw an admirable bath 4 feet in diameter spread out as if by a conjuring trick. If we stopped early enough and the sun was still up, we would send him down to the nearest well and have a glorious time splashing about and sponging cool streams of water over ourselves, while gorgeous butterflies of blue, scarlet, and amber fluttered round us in the thicket, and green parakeets and the bushy-tailed grey squirrels perched on the trees to watch us. Though probably as immoral as any race in the world, the Yucatecans are singularly modest, and, though he saw us minus everything but a smile, revelling in the cool limestone water, and he would sit mournfully by, trying to pick the garrapatas out of his legs and thighs, nothing would induce him to take advantage of our rubber bath, presumably because he feared we might look while he was in the altogether. The villages we passed were monotonously alike. Squares of palm leaf thatched huts round a plot of wiry grass centred by the village well with gibbet-like uprights and crosspiece of wood over which hung the bucket. At all hours of the day there clustered here knots of Indian women and girls, the cantaros, earthenware water jars, balanced on their left hips, as they pattered to and fro to their whitewashed huts with the precious liquid. We generally called our midday halt between these settlements, as we found that our arrival was hailed with the same popular excitement as that which welcomes a circus in an English village; and it is a trifle disconcerting, even if your menu is not very varied, to eat one's lunch in the centre of a serried circle of bright-eyed children and women, and grinning, wondering men. But the fourth day, at the little village of Pokbok, we were so much tempted by the wonderful shade of a large ceibo tree, which stood by the huge ruined church, inside the gaunt staring walls of which a whitewashed Indian hut now did duty for such infrequent services as were held, that we broke our rule. Though we were now deep in Yucatan school season, the heat had been blistering all the morning, and steering as we had been due north on a fairly straight road, the sun on our backs had made us feel quite sick. Thus the deep shade offered by the giant tree, the leafiest of all trees found in the country, was an irresistible temptation. The horses too had suffered, and stood as meek as lambs to be unsaddled. But before we had got far in our preparations for a meal, half the village was round us, to make way in a second for two men, one about 60, with a long tufted beard of grey growing from the extreme limit of his chin, the other some 20 years younger. They cordially introduced themselves as the village Jefe and his son, the latter insisting upon calling himself El Secretario. They kept the store and public house of the village, and, in the absence of customers, had filled up their time by serving themselves so liberally that they were quite merry. They insisted that we should come to their shop and take some of their agua ardiente (fire water), and it lives up to its name too, but we explained that we were teetotalers. End of section 10. Recording by Shena Ser, Fresno, California.